Hello and welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom 2.0 on CAN TV. I am your host, Vaughn, bringing you relevant topics and the news from the week. We'll be right back with our first guest.
Every day in this country, millions of low-income Americans are prevented from finding safe housing, meeting critical healthcare needs, and exercising other rights simply due to our country's inability to ensure that everyone facing a legal problem can access help for it. Join me this week as I meet a change agent working tirelessly to change this narrative. This Thursday at 7 p.m. on CAN TV 19, cantv.org, and on the new CAN TV Plus app.
My first guest is Patrick Smith. He's an award-winning journalist who produced All Things Considered and Morning Edition for WBEZ. He is currently a criminal justice reporter for BEZ. My suburban Detroit neighbor, welcome to the newsroom.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, appreciate you being here. So tell us, what's the latest with the Behr's move?
So on Monday, a lawmaker who represents Arlington Heights introduced a bill that would freeze property taxes on the Arlington Heights race course location that the Bears are eyeing for their move away from Soldier Field. Freeze their property tax assessment for 40 years. It's sort of the latest iteration of different ideas of how to give public support from Arlington Heights to get the Bears to leave Chicago and move their home field there. Interestingly enough, in the Tribune story about that, the lawmaker who introduced it said that she actually had some questions about it herself. Wasn't sure it was the best idea, but she wanted to get it out there, make it part of the conversation. And that's obviously spurred some debate, an ongoing debate about whether or not it's worth it to give public money to the Bears to move. Obviously, you know, people in Chicago don't want that to happen, but I think even in Arlington Heights, there's debate there as to whether or not something like freezing property taxes, which would mean, you know, that's obviously if the Bears move there, that site is going to become a lot more valuable. If you freeze property taxes there, that's a lot less money going to schools and to other things. So there's a real debate as to whether or not that's worthwhile. As that ongoing battle continues, the Bears threatening to leave Chicago, and discussion of whether or not Chicago should do anything to try to keep them in the city at Soldier Field.
So it'll freeze the property taxes, which potentially means more or less money for schools. But then there's going to be more people potentially coming to the area because they're building condos and different housing as well.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's the idea with any time there's these sorts of incentives for a new stadium, right, is you'll bring in, people will come to Arlington Heights that wouldn't have come otherwise. There are new condos. They're going to build other buildings around there. And I should say, I didn't mention this, part of that bill, part of what's being discussed is you'd freeze property tax assessments. The Bears agree they're going to spend $500 million improving the site. So I should have mentioned that as well. I will say, I mean, there's been studies. Now, there have been studies about the economic impact of building a new stadium, and that essentially it never pays off for public financing of a new stadium. I think that maybe there's some nuance there in this situation because, as you talked about, there's talk of other development around it that could affect the calculation. I'm not smart enough to do that calculation, but I do think it's always good to proceed with caution when you're talking about public handouts to big organizations.
And in the short term, I can imagine that the job creation and the commerce and the other businesses that will benefit from the Bears being there, you know, has to be a part of it, but it's a difficult thing. Sticking with the tax incentive, you also have gentrification in Pilsen, and there's been a lot of talk amongst the residents about needing some kind of, you know, tax relief because of the increasing property taxes. Tell me more about that.
There was a GN report this week that said property tax bills for Pilsen homeowners went up 47% in 2022. So last year their bills were almost 50% higher than they had been the year before. So that obviously has a lot of people upset, and it's hurting businesses as well, business owners as well who own their property. That has people upset. The Cook County assessor, who's in charge of determining how much a property is worth, which is what determines how much, one of the things that determines how much you're going to pay in property taxes. He says, the assessor Fritz Kagi says essentially, hey, don't blame me. I assessed all these big commercial properties like in downtown Chicago. I assessed them higher. They were supposed to shoulder more of the tax burden. And then the Cook County Board of Review, they reduced all their property tax assessments. That's why all you homeowners are paying more. The Board of Review, of course, says, hey, that's not fair. You messed up. That's not our fault. I should say that this WGN reporting, it follows, I think it was about a month ago that Block Club reported on a similar thing. They found big increases in Pilsen, Avondale, Rogers Park, essentially gentrifying areas across the city are seeing these big increases in their property tax bills. The assessor's office says, we're not causing gentrification, we're essentially we're tracking it.
Yeah.
This is evidence of gentrification.
Yeah, and
basically.
so, because it seems like Pilsen has been gentrifying for some years, and why is it that the taxes are showing up today versus years before?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. One, the assessor Fritz Kagi has changed the way they do valuations. They say they're doing it more fairly now than under Joe Barrios before the assessor before Kagi came in. But he said that the Board of Review is kind of stymieing these efforts to make it more fair, and that's why. And there was also a change in state law, and I'm getting a little bit out of my depth here. I'm relying on reporting by others. There was a change in state law that allowed taxing bodies to essentially make up the difference. Like if let's say the post office downtown, you know, where Amazon has their headquarters, their Chicago headquarters, if they have a reduction in their valuation, now Cook County, the city of Chicago, can say, okay, well, we got to make up that difference somewhere, so we're going to spread it out throughout all the property owners. That's why we're seeing this pain here. On top of the fact that we had property taxes, I believe, were frozen during COVID, you know, so we had it's a lot of factors all coming together.
Right.
I should say, you know, we talked about it sort of being a measure of gentrification. But if you think about it, it's going to make it worse. Because if you are a lower income resident of a gentrifying area and your property taxes go up, and you can't afford to pay them, you're going to sell.
Yeah.
And the people who can afford to pay them are the rich people who are gentrifying the neighborhood.
And it's probably the renters may have a rent increase because the owner has to pay those taxes.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
So we're going to switch gears and talk about catalytic converters and the theft that has skyrocketed over the past few years. Yeah, what's behind this and which communities are being mostly impacted?
So my understanding is we've seen a big increase like throughout the city of Chicago and in the suburbs, like all of Chicagoland seeing a big increase. I actually don't think it's just in Chicago that we've seen this increase of catalytic converter thefts. You've seen police districts throughout Chicago have like community meetings and town halls. They're doing things like painting catalytic converters as a way to try to, you know, tell a thief like, hey, this, well, you know, if you sell this, it's going to show up and people are going to know that it was stolen. I don't know. No one's been. I don't think there's been anyone's checked to see if that's actually effective. But we have seen this huge surge in both motor vehicle thefts, but then catalytic converter thefts. As far as what's causing it, I mean, you can sell these catalytic converters. They have precious metals that can be sold for a few $100s, is my understanding. And I think it just speaks to desperation. People need money. People are desperate. I mean, I saw a news report the other day that there were thieves stealing from the high school parking lots.
Wow.
And I think, you know, there's one way to look at that, like, oh, these brazen thieves. The other way to think about it is, how desperate do you have to be for money that you're like, I'm going to go in daylight to a school and try to steal, you know, out from under these cars. I think it speaks to the wealth, income inequality that we have and the desperation.
Yeah, and it speaks to opportunity because they seem to be so valuable that, you know, even somebody who's just an opportunist and not necessarily desperate may take advantage of that.
You're totally right. Not everybody who's stealing is desperate. And I'm sure it's a thing like social contagion. Like, if you had never, you know, if nobody told you could go steal catalytic converters, you would never have thought of it.
Right.
But then you hear, hey, I know other people did it. I saw it on the news.
Right.
I could probably make a few $100. So,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So I hear you working on something new. Tell us about The Motive.
Yeah, so I am the host of, and I reported season 5 of WBEZ's Motive podcast. It's really in your wheelhouse. I spent a lot of time, like more than a year, with 2 anti-violence workers on the west side of Chicago. A woman named Cecilia Mannion, who's a victim advocate in Little Village, and a man named Sorenzo Strong, who goes by Fats, who's an outreach worker in the East Garfield Park neighborhood. Got to be with them as they were helping gunshot victims, as they were intervening in gang disputes, trying to prevent retaliatory shootings. I think it really provides, and I think that it provides a service. The reason there's a service here is because these workers really opened their lives up and their work to me, and I'm so grateful to them. I think because of that access that they gave me, there's real insight into what's driving the shootings, the lives of the people at the center of Chicago's gun violence, and what it might take to stop it.
Right. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for your perspective. We'll be right back with our roundtable discussion.
This week on In the Money, we're talking about credit 101.
So credit scores have a range. It could be as high as 850. It could be as low as 500.
So imagine trying to get your credit score from a 430 to a 700. Credit takes years to build, and it takes one bad decision to blow.
Join me, Kimberly Loftus, Thursday at 7:30 p.m. on CAN-TV 19, CANTV.org, and on the new CAN-TV Plus app.
The Safety Act took effect at the start of the year, minus a key provision. The portion of the Safety Act that eliminates cash bail was stayed by a judge hours before the bill was set to take effect. The bill's other provisions that did take effect, like limiting when defendants can be deemed flight risks, allowing defendants under electronic monitoring to leave home for 48 hours before they can be charged with escape, and preventing police from arresting nonviolent trespassers have been widely criticized by politicians and commentators on both sides of the political spectrum. Here to discuss the bill are Garien Gatewood, Program Director of the Illinois Justice Program, Emmanuel, Director of Policy and Strategic Litigation at the Cook County Public Defender's Office, and Madeline Behr, Policy Director of the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
For sure. So, Jerry, I'm gonna start with you. Tell me what the goal of the legislation is.
Yeah, so the goal of the legislation for the Safety Act overall was a big piece of work that was led by the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. Throughout the beginning of COVID, post-George Floyd, you saw an effort, well, it wasn't post-George Floyd, but after the George Floyd murder, you saw an effort by the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus to address 4 different areas: criminal justice, healthcare, education, and economics. The criminal justice pillar included the Safety Act, which a part of the Safety Act was the Pretrial Fairness Act. We have seen historically throughout this state, throughout this country, the use of money as a determining factor in freedom. We've had a wealth-based system that has determined whether or not a person whether or not they're a threat to public safety has not really been a part of the conversation. The conversation is really focused on their pocketbook and their ability to pay. So what you've seen from that is we wanted to create a system that was, 1, more individualized, 2, was not focused on wealth, 3, one that would actually bring us public safety, one that would actually move towards public safety. That's not the system we've had, no matter what the pundits say, no matter what opposition says, because if we have had a system that was based on public safety, we wouldn't be in a state that has 4 million people with records and have one of the largest prison populations in the world. So what the Safety Act aimed to do was to start to right some of those wrongs. The first step, and hopefully many, because there's a lot of work that still is left to be done.
Right. Yeah. And so, given the clients you serve, tell me why you support the bill.
Well, as Garien mentioned before, this idea of having to step up and represent somebody, and first of all, everyone we serve is presumed innocent, right? So you're standing there and someone's presumed innocent, but unfortunately their bank account might very well determine the outcome of what this is. So that's why one of the reasons we wanted us to be, we want everyone to rethink that. This is really a transformative change here, right? Where people can go in and that presumption of innocence could really hold tight because money is no longer a factor. Right. So the person does not have to worry about whether it's losing that job or that education, all those different things that goes along once someone don't have the money to post. So that's really why we really support it, is because of this idea of transforming the system that we're in, where there is a real presumption that someone's going to be able to have a shot at getting out that's not going to be dependent on their pocketbook, but just those 2 key factors, right? Number 1, is there a public safety risk? And then number 2, will they show up back in court? That's it. Those 2 fundamental factors. And those should be reviewed, individualized, and money should not be based on, play a part in that review.
And what about the clients you serve?
Yeah, so we serve clients who are survivors of rape and sexual assault and trafficking. And what we find is that when victims are going to court and trying to understand what the process is in the criminal legal system, they're often not getting notified about bond court, what happens with the defendant in their case. Next steps going forward, what we really find is that this new system, once we finally get these provisions hopefully into effect, it's going to be a system based on risk and safety, not on wealth. So for survivors, they can know that the person that has harmed them, doesn't matter how much money they have, the judge is going to have to make an individualized decision in that detention hearing about whether a person is a risk to them and the community or not whether they have money or not. We've seen time and time again people who have caused harm who are wealthy being able to bail out, and people who have committed potentially nonviolent offenses who stay in jail for a really long time. It's not a system that's based in equity, so hopefully this new system is really going to get us into a better place for all folks in the criminal legal system.
And so what's the opposition to this bill, or this part of the bill?
I mean, one of the things that we hear time and time again is that victims of crime are going to be harmed. But as Garien said, the system has never been supportive of victims of crime, frankly. Victims are often left out of the process. They don't understand the system. They're not actually represented in court. As much as prosecutors and law enforcement say, we represent the victim, we support victims, and that's kind of the narrative that you hear oftentimes, they're representing the state, they're representing the government. That is a very different interest than a lot of the clients that we serve who may want to engage with law enforcement, who may not want to engage in law enforcement, or don't want their narrative and their story and their experience used in a courtroom in such a way that really denigrates their experience.
Anybody else have a?
Yeah, I would say one of the other big pieces of the opposition, right, and Maryland knocked it out of the park. One other piece is the answer to all your questions is money, right? Because, again, this has been a wealth-based system, and people have used these resources to fund their criminal legal systems, because it's not a justice system. So people have been able to use those resources for jobs and careers and the functioning of those actual systems. Now, if you go to a clerk of a particular county, or you go to that judge or that circuit and you say, well, how much of this is actually going from the bonds to funneling the system? They couldn't tell you, but they know it goes into the PAL. So that was a big source of the conversation. You didn't hear a lot of that in the beginning. You heard, oh, this is about public safety. This is about public safety. The longer that went on, now you're starting to see people say, well, this is a resource issue. Now you're starting to see some of it pivot. Not all of the opposition, but some people are finally starting to pull the curtain back and say, no, this is about money. This is really about money for folks. So yeah.
So over the course of the time when the legislation was being developed, have there been any ways where it's been amended or strengthened over time that for the better?
Yeah, absolutely, and that goes to one of the arguments we heard, like as if this was being rushed through, right? And the reality is it can't be further from the truth. I mean, we're talking about at least 4 years of back and forth. There's actually a Illinois Supreme Court task force just on this to look at pretrial issues. That was back in April of 2020, right? 86-page report, and now here we are still today. So there's been a lot of time, a lot of effort. People on all sides of the aisle has had plenty of opportunity to go back and forth on this. So this is not something that just came out last night, so there's been tons of effort in terms of reforms and things associated with that to make this bill stronger.
Right. And do we know how the existing parts of the legislation are playing out, or is it too soon to tell?
Well, the existing parts of the legislation around the PFA or the Safety Act overall?
The Safety Act overall.
So the Safety Act overall, some of the portions have been implemented, so you still have measures around mandatory supervised release, which deal with the Illinois Department of Corrections and the Prisoner Review Board. You have some areas around policing, and I got to tell you, we don't have enough time to really dig into that because there's a lot there. There's a lot there on misconduct, decertification, a lot of that body cams. So there's a lot of that work that's still going on. So a lot of those effective dates have been missed by law enforcement.
Is that related to the consent decree? Or
No. So this
separate?
is totally separate. So at the state level, we mapped out quite a few areas to work on police reform, right? So as a part of it, because you asked earlier, have there been changes? So there's been 3 or 4 trailer bills. And in some of those trailer bills, we were able to address some of the areas in policing. And now with the latest trailer bill, if I was to put a percentage on it, it was probably 95% focused on the PFA. So there have been other provisions that people are starting to work on, but it does not have that same level of groundswell and focus that the PFA brought. The PFA brought a lot of that attention for a couple of reasons. One, money. 2, that was a focal point during the election. So I'm sure you remember getting those fake newspapers to your home, where the first couple of them were focused on policing, and then it went over to the PFA. And it stayed on the PFA for a while because that impacts not only what we do here in Illinois, that's going to impact folks across the nation. So you look at the blueprint that has been set out on how we create a better system, a system that is not based on wealth. When you start really digging into pockets, you start to get a whole lot more attention, right? So even though we don't have the bail bonds industry here, they're still paying attention because these are things that can happen in those jurisdictions as well. So that's why you start to see this be a focal point. And this is why you also saw years, again, like Emmanuel mentioned earlier, there's over 100 members of the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice and the Coalition to End Money Bond, 100 organizations. So folks have been working on this around the clock for quite a while, so you've been able to see the pushback on that. You've been able to see people defend those efforts. We don't have that same level of groundswell in those other areas of the Safety Act yet, but the day is young. So we'll see when we get there.
So where are we now, and what do we see coming soon in terms of getting this part through?
I mean, I think we're really in a little bit of a waiting period because of the recent lawsuit that's now being held by the Supreme Court. We're kind of in a waiting period. I mean, there's provisions that Garien had said that are going into effect that we're kind of waiting for law enforcement and other folks to catch up on. But this is really giving us, I think, some more solid time to make sure that this law is implemented correctly. I know that a lot of us were kind of like rushing to the gate a little bit in December, and maybe this gives us a little bit more time to, get things ready. But I know many of us in Cook County in particular have been working on forms, what hearings are going to look like. I mean, some of the meetings we've had have been what courtroom are these going to be occurring in what building? So as things that are very high scale, very high level, all the way down to what courtroom are these hearings going to be happening in. So we've been doing a lot of work, and that work is going to continue until we can get more further guidance from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, as was mentioned, I mean, there's over 2 years now of implementation teams just working on this. I know at the Cook County Public Defender's Office, we have a whole new division to be able to help address the changes that's coming with the PFA. So, and people have been working and preparing for that. And then, just days before January 1st, to get the news and the change, it makes it a little bit harder, but it does give us that opportunity. I mean, we are very cautiously optimistic, to be very honest with you. We have over 400 people who have signed the amicus brief in support of the PFA. So we're, and all of this is evidence-based too. This is not, a couple of lawyers sitting in a room coming up with, this is years of advocates pounding the pavements and going through tons of lessons learned from other jurisdictions.
So how has the new department or the new division that you mentioned spend their time? Like, what are they trying to get prepared for?
Well, we still, we still have bond court, so we're still spending and investing our time in that, and the teams are still meeting in terms of the implementation teams to be able to take advantage of this moment. To be very honest with you, to be able to make sure that when this happens, and it will, that we hit the ground running, because of all the scare tactics out there. It's as if day one the system's going to collapse, and it could be further from the truth. You asked before, I mean, there's already been parts of it that's been implemented, especially around electronic home monitoring, where there's been more, in terms of expanding the amount, people can now go out and do laundry and things like that, which is a shame to think about, but, it didn't have the impact that people were told it was going to have, so we're not surprised whatsoever.
So meaning it didn't have the negative impact in terms of electronic monitoring?
Oh, absolutely. It did not have the negative impact that, that was being touted that would have, as if somebody on electronic home monitoring would now go out and create, just more crime. And again, it goes to this presumption we're making. First of all, people are presumed innocent. And when you're on electronic home monitoring, you want to be done with your case. You want to prove your innocence. So the vast majority of people, that's further from the truth. They don't want to do anything else that's going to bring any attention.
It's funny you say that, because there's a part of me that wonders for the people who are the business behind the technology, if they put that out there to create, a little bit of tension back and forth, because at the end of the day, they benefit from electronic monitoring and having people basically be imprisoned in their own home. So that's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, and right on, that's a great point. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the expansion of just that, people being imprisoning in their own home. And what does that mean? When we say their own home, we're talking about families. We're talking about kids that's now part of this process. So,
I mean, I gotta add, I mean, fear and money have been real drivers in a lot of the opposition here. I mean, there's been an incredible amount of misinformation around electronic monitoring, around the end of money bail and what that means. And it unfortunately is an incredibly motivating factor to keep things the status quo. And what our coalition has done is really brought a variety of groups together. As Emmanuel said, over 400 groups signed an amicus brief. That was faith leaders, racial justice organizations, criminal justice reform, victims advocacy groups. I mean, a variety of people coming together and saying this is a more equitable, better policy for the state of Illinois. And we have to do everything we can to really go against that fear and that misinformation, because that is what drives people to the polls. So that's why they're spending a lot of time and resources, but we're doing the best we can to counteract that.
Can you think of another sort of issue that you had to come together, or did you have this much support for in your career?
I will say, from the vantage point that I've seen, and you can even walk through how the trailer bill negotiations have gone. In the other areas, no. Where we are right now with the Pretrial Fairness Act and the groundswell that came from this, it's not like anything I've ever seen before. Because for the first time, if you look at the last set of trailer bills, you had law enforcement, state's attorneys who have historically, in Springfield, as you know, you've spent some time down in Springfield, when they said, hey, we don't want this, that was almost the end of the discussion. Well, now you've seen where negotiations include states attorneys, law enforcement, advocates, and public defenders. And you had all of those entities slipping neutral on the bill, meaning some folks won, some folks lost, but we got to a place where we thought together, in good faith, this is something we can move forward on. So we have not seen this groundswell before, but it is promising. It's promising for a few reasons. Now we understand that there can be a level playing field. If we work together, if we strategize, if we build our communications, and understanding that this is the first step in what we can build is something special. We haven't seen this before. We hadn't seen it in other places. We talked to folks all around the country who worked on bomb reform, who worked on policing, who worked on all of these other issues. They hadn't seen it like this before, and we're excited. We're excited because there's a lot more work to do.
You should be, and hopefully you guys will come back and hang out with us again, and we'll have better news to talk about, and we'll be on to the next thing. So Garien, Emmanuel, Madeline, thank you for joining us, and we'll be right back with our final thought.
This week on Generation Flex, we talk about dating. I'm told it's rough out here in these streets. What are the rules around approaching people now?
Now that part, I'm lost because I'm lost on that part, and I'm lost on going back to the dating and courting.
Generation Flex airs Mondays at 7 p.m. on CAN TV 19, cantv.org, and on the new CAN TV Plus app.
A recent Chicago Sun-Times editorial cited a new study by the National Institute of Health that found that the risk of men between the ages of 18 and 29 losing their lives in a shooting in the 60624 zip code is higher than the death rate of U.S. soldiers who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Researchers say their findings point to a need for more trauma-related services. This report validates the Pritzker-Traubert Foundation Chicago Prize winner Sankofa Wellness Village. The initiative will bring wellness, art, business, and other opportunities and services to the Madison and Pulaski corridor. The village will receive a $10 million grant that will go towards an estimated $50 million project. I am excited about this project and look forward to bringing you representatives of the project on our show next week. I'll be back here again next week, amplifying community voices and analyzing the news that matters to Chicagoans. Until then, good night.